I'd like to welcome everybody to this seminar in our Labour Studies seminar series. The series is run by the Neil Agate Labour Studies Unit at the university currently known as Rhodes in the Eastern Cape. Some of you have been at our seminars before, but just for those who knew or maybe less familiar with our program, the Neil Agate Labour Studies Unit is we're engaged in a range of things, really a project hub. We're engaged in some work around policy. We do a lot of research that includes things like labor history, quantitative analysis, which is part of what we'll be looking at today, a very broad range of things. And we are involved in workers' education. One of the things that we're involved in is running a program with metal workers unions in the Eastern Cape, which is backed by the MERSITA. This particular series of seminars is funded by the FES, the Frederick Herbert Stiftung, who also kindly fund our Vuyisile Mini Workers School. Now, the Vuyisile Mini Workers School is named after a son of the Eastern Cape from Tomo in the mountains who was active in trade unions in Port Elizabeth, Gqeberha, was a founder member of Umkhonto weSizwe, was a member of the Communist Party and the African National Congress, part of the Umkhonto weSizwe High Command, and executed in the 60s, and was only recently, a year and a bit ago, reburied at his homestead. Our unit is named for Neil Agate. Dr. Neil Hudson Agate was a trade unionist in South Africa, a medical doctor. He was brutalized and tortured by the apartheid government and was found dead in his cell. There's an ongoing inquiry, and we hope that will be resolved soon. And in fact, it would have been his birthday today. He has a link to Makanda, where we're based, in that he did his schooling here, although he was originally from Kenya. Before I introduce Mike, I just want to mention that the Labour Studies seminar series is broad, in the sense that we take labor studies to mean not simply dealing with issues around labor markets or dealing with issues around industrial relations. We've done talks and hosted talks and book launches on things ranging from labor history and the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, or ICU of the 20s, dock workers in San Francisco, the Marikana massacre, the rise of insurgent unionism on platinum mines. It's a wide range of things. So I'd like to advise you to have a look at our website. There are podcasts of a number of our previous talks. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Mike Rogan. Sorry, somebody I need to admit. Professor Mike Rogan works in the Department of Economics and Economic History at Rhodes University. He has long been involved with NOLSU. He's one of the people that really got it up and running. He's involved in a number of projects in addition to his academic duties in the department. Mike is also involved in WeGo, and his research focuses largely on informal employment, gender, poverty, inequality, food security, education, and skills development and survey design. I'm just going to give the title of Mike's talk, so not to preempt anything there. Same storm, different boat, COVID-19, precarity, and the South African labor market. Now, before Mike gets started, the way we will do this, we will first give Mike 30 or 40 minutes to present. Then after that, we'll open up for discussion. We'll normally take bundles of questions, 2 or 3. The speaker can then respond. We can do another session, and we'll go on as interest and the discussion carries on. So we don't necessarily have a very sharp cutoff time. The more the merrier. The final announcement is, if you're not on our email or WhatsApp group lists, please feel free to put your name and details in the conversation bar, and we'll capture those and add you to future lists and mailouts. All right, without any further ado, Mike, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. Can I just check that you can hear me before I start talking?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, thank you, Precious. Appreciate that. One doesn't want to talk for 20 minutes before discovering that no one can hear them. So first of all, thanks to Lucian for the introduction, to Valence for all of the work on promoting and getting this together. And of course, thanks to all of you for making the time to spend more time on Zoom. We really appreciate the participation. One thing I'll add, when Lucian mentioned how diverse these labor study seminars are, we once had one to celebrate the birthday of the Magna Carta. So we really have quite a broad sort of range of topics that we explore in this labor market series. The presentation I'm giving today is based on a book chapter that I'm contributing to an edited volume, which I'm co-editing with a colleague from WeGo, which for those who don't know, stands for Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing. And it's a global research advocacy network that's particularly concerned with supporting the livelihoods of the working poor. The edited volume is concerned with the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis, the ongoing impacts on informal workers around the world, and trying to unpack what that means for understanding the role of work and labor markets in human development. So this is something that will ultimately be a contribution to that book, and it's just for me a really nice opportunity to present some of the findings for one of the first times and help think through how to position this, hopefully with some input from some or all of you. To start, I think one of the things to acknowledge is that if nothing else, what this crisis has done is to shine a light on pre-existing inequalities, whether that's in the economy more broadly or, as I'm particularly interested in the labor market. So it hasn't created inequalities, but it certainly widened them in a number of ways, and that's particularly true, I think, in the labor market and in the world of work. So that's really one of the motivating factors behind this particular piece of research. So what I'll do today is I'll start by walking through a few of the terms that I use and discuss how they relate to each other. I'll then quickly give an overview of several frameworks that help us understand how work and how labor markets respond to economic crises, such as the one we're experiencing. I'll then go through a series of findings. I'll present 5 or 6 slides showing what we know about the impacts of this particular crisis on the South African labor market, and then conclude with something which I hope will lead to a discussion by identifying some of the gaps in the state's response to this particular crisis and the ways that our understandings and misunderstandings of precarious and informal employment have contributed to some of those gaps, and of course, all with a view to looking a bit further down the road to thinking what a meaningful recovery would look like for the majority of the world's workforce and a sizable group in the South African labor market as well. All right. So I'm going to unpack the term informal in a moment, but I think the first thing that is important to acknowledge is that when we talk about marginalized workers, vulnerable segments of the labor market, we're really not talking about a small minority. Globally, most workers are informal in the ways that I'm going to define them in a moment, and it's not even a slight majority. It's a fairly commanding majority. Over 60% of all workers in the world are measured or identified as informal. About 45% of this group are own account workers, and these are people we would describe as informally self-employed without employing others. So it's difficult to think of this group as informal firms or informal enterprises or informal entrepreneurs as we typically conceive of them. These are often survivalist workers. So we can think of groups of workers selling goods in markets or on the sides of streets in our urban areas. This group is the single largest. It makes up about 45% of global informal employment. The other sizable group is then informal employees of various types. They make up about 36%. So combined here, these two groups make up the vast majority of informal workers in the world. So it really is, when we think about the global workforce, we really should be thinking about this particular group, the employer-employee relationship, which often springs to mind, is not the reality for the majority of workers in the world. There is, of course, quite a bit of regional variation, and I won't go into the details of these statistics, but just to paint a picture, this is not limited to developing countries. In countries such as the US and some of the countries in Southern Europe, a fifth or a quarter of the labor market can be measured as informal. We often use the word precarity, and I've used that in the title of this particular talk. Precarity is related to informal employment, but it carries with it several connotations, which I think are important to identify at the beginning here. The notion of precarious employment really started gaining traction in the 1970s and is largely a northern, and has been and continues to be, a northern-based concept to describe work that is more temporary, more short-term, and less secure than the traditional employer-employee relationship that was seen as the model in the post-war era, in particular in the North. So as this trend towards less stable employment became prevalent in the North, the word precarious was used to describe workers with this type of employment relationship. We can measure it, and it's typically measured, and particularly in the OECD countries, through a concept called non-standard employment. And this can be picked up in national labor force surveys by identifying workers who are in short-term, limited duration types of contracts, or who are hired through third parties, such as labor brokers or temporary employment agencies. And various types of intermittent contract workers can also be measured and identified as precarious. The term itself, though, has moved beyond the measurement sphere or the broad concept of limited duration in employment, and focuses now on a number of features or characteristics of employment, which typically include things such as low wages or insecure wages, commission-based work, lack of social protection or work benefits, and most recently, it's been characterized by a lack of autonomy or control around the tasks that a person would have in their workplace. So precarity has become a sort of expanding term, which has been found to be quite useful in the analysis of contemporary forms of labor, particularly in the North. And it's really sort of come into its own in describing, or at least trying to group, various types of what we might call ambiguous self-employment. So perhaps the best examples of these are various types of gig workers, such as Uber drivers, as well as Deliveroo type drivers. Those types of workers have often been captured as independent contractors, but as I'm sure most of you know, many sort of legal cases in the US and the UK have actually challenged this as disguised employment relationships. But again, the features of this type of work often are captured by the term precarity, which continues to be fairly popular with a certain bias to the global North. Informal employment is a broader umbrella category. The framework has been developing in terms of measurement and conceptualization over the past 15 years, with considerable and substantial inputs from the WeGo network, of which I'm a part, and grateful to see various other members of the WeGo network in the audience today. And this is an attempt to have a global system of categorizing, a framework to measure informal employment so that we can compare across different countries. So I think one useful way to think about precarity as being a component of informal employment. So the definition that I'll use throughout this presentation is the same one used by countries around the world. It's typically used by the ILO to give comparative statistics about employment conditions across countries. And most crucially, for those of us interested in the South African context, this is the precise definition, the precise framework that the Statistics South Africa operationalizes in its quarterly labor force surveys. So when we define informal employment, which includes most types of precarious employment, we usually consider two groups as being subsets of the informal economy or informal employment more broadly. The first is any type of informal employment inside the informal sector. And the informal sector we define as any type of employment in unregistered or unincorporated enterprises. So if you're a South African or you live in South Africa, you can think of spaza shops that aren't registered for tax or VAT. You can think of waste pickers who recycle goods for money. Or you can think of street vendors or market vendors who have no sort of relationship with the state or regulation as working inside the informal sector. But there's a second group, and this includes employees, contributing family workers who work perhaps in informal enterprises, but also in public enterprises and in the private sector or for nonprofit institutions who are not covered legally by social protection or other employment benefits due to the nature of employment. This also includes employees in private households. The single largest group there in South Africa would be domestic workers who are working without written contracts and without any type of medical aid or pension contribution from their employment. So essentially what these two groups or subcomponents of informal employment have in common is that they lack access to social protection, or in many cases, legal protection through their employment. So they're vulnerable in the sense that they don't have much recourse in the event of a loss of earnings or a bad turn of health, or many of the things which or saving towards their retirement in their old age. So we tend to use these three concepts interchangeably, which causes confusion: precarity, non-standard employment, and informal employment. But what they all have in common, and in particular those who are concerned with the plight of precarious and informal workers, is the desire to achieve better coverage by social protection for these groups, so they're not left as vulnerable as those with formal social protection through their employment, and to promote rights of representation and collective bargaining. So these are some of the threads that sort of bring together those who are interested in precarious employment, largely in the North, and those of us who are interested in informal employment in the cities and countries across the global South. So obviously this doesn't preclude the diversity of the types of work and the working arrangements, but it's an attempt to try and measure types of work that are more vulnerable than others. So before moving to sort of understanding some of the frameworks that help us understand informal employment, I think an important footnote is the critique of the concept of precarity. So in the previous slide, I've suggested some of the things we have in common in different parts of the world looking at employment without adequate protection. But there's a fairly consistent and well-documented critique in the literature of sort of labor more broadly, or labor markets, and that's that precarity doesn't seem to apply as much to the South as it does to the North, and that's largely because the concept of precarious employment tended to emerge in the context of an erosion of worker rights, and that was largely in the context of the gains that were made in the post-war era, where stable employment and admittedly the single male breadwinner model was the norm. So precarity very much speaks to the erosion of some of the employment rights that were experienced in kind of the booming years after the Second World War. This isn't the experience in much of the global South, as many labor scholars have pointed out, where precarious or informal or dangerous and low-paid work have been the norm for centuries. So precarity doesn't represent a new phenomenon in much of the global South, which is something that sort of sets us apart in the countries of the South, and the connotations with precarity as being taking a step backwards don't have as much relevance. But just putting that aside, we can, I think, still agree that there are many characteristics between precarious employment and informal employment, even though the causes, the typologies, and the nature of that employment is relatively different. There are certainly some conceptual underpinnings that suggest there are similarities, both north and south. So turning more closely to the concept of informality, which is, if you think back to the second slide I show, in many developing and emerging economies, consists largely of informal self-employment in the informal sector. Certainly not exclusively, but there's a large focus in the developing country literature on informal sector own account work or self-employment. So these frameworks are largely concerned with explaining what causes informality in countries like that, but can certainly be extended to some of the non-standard and precarious types of employment that are more common in the north and are becoming increasingly common. But what's important about these frameworks is they not only help us sort of get to grips with the sources of informality in our labor markets, but they also shape our approach to improving working conditions or improving the returns from labor markets. And as they differ quite significantly, so do the policy proposals that come from each one. And that's particularly the case in terms of the policy proposals that come in response to the current crisis. So I'll just go through these very quickly, but just a caveat that these are not meant to be mutually exclusive. It's not the case that we would push to choose one which explains informality in total or informality in a country. In any given labor market and any given national economy, any one of these frameworks can be used to describe different types of employment that we would capture as informal more broadly. But we can discuss these as four sort of frameworks for framing the analysis. The first, and a fairly popular one, and seems to be making a resurgence, particularly in the economics literature, is the idea that informal work, particularly self-employment, is voluntary. And many people choose to be informal precisely to evade regulations, taxes, and other costs of operating formally. So from the voluntarist point of view, much of informal employment we see in markets and on our streets in developing countries is voluntary and is chosen to avoid regulations and taxes. Another fairly common framework in the economics literature is that of dualism, where we see is the informal economy and various types of informal employment as being sort of a residual, unabsorbed workforce that is unrelated to the formal economy. So it's something we don't tend to study as a phenomenon on its own, but it's something which happens when the formal economy can't absorb the total workforce. So its key feature is that there's a clear distinction between the functioning of the formal economy and the functioning of the informal economy. I'm, of course, giving highly stylized accounts of these perspectives. There are many diverse views within each one. Legalism is perhaps a variant of voluntarism. It sees informal workers as working informally because they're excluded from the formal sector by cumbersome regulations which restrict the ease of entry into formal types of employment or formal businesses. And then finally, there's I think a more nuanced approach, which we describe as structuralism, which acknowledges that informal and formal economies are intrinsically linked with one another, but what makes them differ is the unequal power relations, both in the market, in production, and in employment relationships. So we would sort of say that informal employment is dominated by informal employment or by formal employment or a formal sector. One of the critiques from structuralists is that informal enterprises and informal wage workers in many contexts conveniently provide cheap goods and services and are subservient to formal sector supply chains. There's been quite a lot of work by, if we people are happy to be called structuralists in South Africa, and they typically use terms such as adverse incorporation or ideas such as markets at the margin to describe the way that informal workers, and particularly the self-employed, are disadvantaged by their insertion into the exploitative parts of global value chains or supply chains. So as you can imagine, each one of these has very different ideas on how to address informality, and indeed, in some cases, what the goal should be in terms of addressing informality. Voluntarism and legalism in particular aim to eliminate the informal economy, whereas structuralists are more largely concerned with improving the livelihoods and working conditions of those in the informal economy. So when we find ourselves in times of crisis, whether it's a very specific health and economic crisis, such as the one we currently find ourselves in, or past crises, such as the global financial crisis, or whether it's a typical sort of short-term recession, these four perspectives tend to have fairly different ideas of how the dynamics between formal and informal employment tend to change. In fact, this is actually a fairly ongoing field of research, and the World Bank has just published a book about 2 months ago, which has a specific focus on this particular feature of informal employment. There's often been in the economics literature and probably more leaning more towards the legalist, dualist, and voluntarist approaches that when an economic crisis happens and jobs are lost in the formal sector, informal economies would tend to expand and act as a safety net for those who've lost their jobs in the formal sector. And so would see informal employment as a sort of free entry option, which would allow workers to ride out the crisis until the formal economy absorbs workers again. However, structuralists generally have a fairly different expectation, which is that since informal economies are subordinate to the formal sector in many contexts, and obviously depending on the structure of both workforces and the nature of the crisis, it's also very likely that informal economies might actually contract or lose ground during a crisis as much as or more than workers in the formal sector. So in the past 18 months, there has been much debate about which one of these scenarios is more likely in general, but also which one seems to be the case given our current crisis, which has some unique features, not least of which is government restrictions on which type of activities and which types of employment are able to occur. There's certainly been a view that informal workers are perhaps more flexible and resilient in the face of this particular crisis. But then there's also been the acknowledgement that informal workers don't have the luxury of working from home. They certainly don't have access to employment benefits or unemployment insurance or any type of income to hold them over through social protection or social insurance. So the debate has very much been about precisely how informal employment has responded during what is now both a health and economic crisis. So I'll switch now to the South African context to try and sort of address this question or give some evidence to suggest what we're seeing in relation to the present crisis. But I'd start by saying that at the outset of this crisis, there was a very encouraging acknowledgement that informal workers would be disproportionately affected. That hasn't been the past, and that hasn't been the case in past crises. And there was a great deal of attention by some of the large multilateral agencies, such as the World Bank and the International Labour Organization, giving very dire warnings that 60% of the global workforce was in very real risk of losing their livelihoods with nothing to support them in the absence of their earnings. So precisely that lack of social protection or job security led many to anticipate that there would be nothing short of a humanitarian crisis at the beginning of the pandemic. The South African government was equally concerned about the plight of informal workers and was particularly aware that the current social protection system, the social grants, had a large gap for working age young people who weren't parents of children receiving the child support grants. So the South African presidency assembled a task team precisely to look at the gaps into which many informal sector workers would fall. Sadly, as it turns out, most of these dire predictions and the ensuing humanitarian crisis did come to pass, and as is still happening in many parts of the world, including South Africa, I would argue. But in a nutshell, what happened in South Africa at the beginning of the crisis was that somewhere between 2 and 3 million jobs were lost in the first quarter of 2020. This coincided with that first lockdown we had in South Africa, which was described as being one of the most severe in the world. And you'll all remember that we weren't allowed to leave our homes for a period. So obviously workers were not allowed to leave their homes and earn a living. This loss of jobs was roughly double the impact of job losses from the 2008-2009 global financial crisis, which was the single largest shock to the South African labor market in the post-apartheid period, just to underline the severity of the crisis in which we currently sit. And as I'll demonstrate in a moment, we're still roughly at the very minimum, something like 1.5 million jobs short of where we would have been without this current crisis. So we're very much in the middle of it at the moment. Both of these crises, being completely different in nature, were disproportionately borne by the South African informal economy. In other words, both during the global financial crisis and certainly during the current crisis, informal workers lost their jobs at a much higher rate than formal workers. And this was much remarked on during the global financial crisis because it was so unexpected given some of the theoretical frameworks that have been used to understand informal employment. So very little evidence that the South African informal economy or informal sector has absorbed jobs lost by the formal economy. So I'm going to share with you about 6 slides to give you an idea of what exactly has happened to different groups of informal workers, and then I'll conclude with some comments on the state's response. Just to note that all of these estimates come from the Statistics South Africa's quarterly labor force surveys. I've done the analysis myself, but these are nationally representative labor force surveys and are largely comparable with labor force surveys conducted in countries around the world. But happy to answer any questions about the data or the analysis when we get to the discussion. So perhaps the easiest way to look at the impact of the crisis is to consider the relative job losses by different groups of workers by quarter. So these are year-on-year estimates. So these are 2020 estimates relative to the same quarter in 2019 to account for seasonal fluctuations in different types of employment. I've organized the data into 4 quarters, which you can see with those blue Q1, 2, 3, and 4. And then I'm presenting the data by informal employment, formal employment, the light gray bar in the middle there in each quarter, and then finally total employment. So as you can see in quarter 1, there were very small and sort of unnoticeable changes between quarter 1 of 2020 and quarter 1 of 2019, meaning when we started 2020, things looked pretty much the way they did in the previous year, which is typically how things start out with our labor market, which typically shows very few changes. Quarter 2, however, is a drastically different story. And this was the most severe part of the crisis during the hard lockdown where we weren't allowed out of our homes. And if you look to the 3rd bar there, you can see that negative 13.3. Those 2.2 million jobs that I mentioned in the previous slide are represented by a 13.3% decrease in total employment. So we lost 13.3% of our total employment numbers in that quarter 2 of 2020. The 2 bars to the left show the differences between those relative job losses in informal employment and formal employment. So what should be jumping out at you immediately is the far larger losses, relative losses in informal jobs. Informal employment decreased by about 29%, whereas formal employment decreased by only about 8%. So this is what we mean by the disproportionate job losses in the informal economy. If you move to the right there to quarters 3 and 4, you can see that there's a slow recovery as the economy opened up again, and to some degree we learned to live with the pandemic. But in each of these quarters and the quarters that have followed into 2021, you can see that those employment losses relative to the previous year are still significantly greater for informal workers. And this includes domestic workers, as I'll show in a moment. But the message here really is that there's very little evidence that the South African informal sector or the South African informal economy was absorbing these jobs lost by the formal sector. It appears to be far less resilient in terms of the recovery. By quarter 4, total employment in the formal sector, or formal employment, was down only 4.5% compared to almost 18% amongst the informal economy. So for those of you who are slightly more quantitatively minded, and I can see some of you, including you, Prof. Mbata, in the audience, what will occur to you from the descriptive account in the previous slide is that doesn't really take into account the differences, the different composition of the formal and informal labor markets. And it certainly doesn't account for overall changes in labor market status. In other words, shifts not just between formal employment and informal employment, but also into unemployment and withdrawal from the labor force. So what you can see in front of you in the second figure here are the results from a typical labor market regression, where we look at the probability of being in the 5 main states of labor market states, and then conditioning that on typical characteristics that influence the labor market, such as gender, race, education, age, marital status, and then a series of fixed effects for the province you live in. And it's a typical labor market regression. And then I've taken from that the average predicted probabilities of being in either formal employment, informal employment, unemployment, discouraged unemployment, which means you've given up searching, or labor market inactivity, meaning you've withdrawn from the labor market, the labor force completely. So without spending too much time on this, I'll just draw your attention to the green bars, and I've circled in the key below that this denotes informal employment. And I've broken it down into women and men's labor market status. So on the left there, you can see a bar for women in 2019 and a bar for women in 2020. So I just draw your attention to the green bar in 2019 and the green bar in 2020, or the green band in that bar. And you can see the average predicted probability of being in informal employment for women amongst the working age cohort as a whole, decreased from 12.3% to 7.7%. Okay, so if in relative and absolute terms, you can see that drop is far greater, or considerably greater than it was for the drop in formal employment amongst women over that same period. And that comparison is for the orange bars at the orange bands at the bottom of those 2 bars. So formal employment for women, or the probability of being in formal employment, dropped from about 21% to about 16%. So clearly the drop that you saw in the previous slide, suggesting the disproportionate impact on informal employment, can also be seen in a typical labor market model. I've done the same for men in the right-hand side of the screen there. And you can follow the green bar for informal employment again, suggesting that the predicted probability of being in informal employment dropped from about 19% to 12% for men. And again, that drop is in absolute terms slightly larger than for the drop in formal employment, but in relative terms is considerably larger for formal employment. Of course, the other change you can see is the top band in each of the bars. Due to the strange nature of this crisis, where we were locked in our homes, there was a large shift into economic inactivity. In other words, not being in the labor market or the labor force at all. But essentially what this confirms is that a typical econometric analysis of the changes in the labor market between 2019 and 2020 confirmed the descriptive statistics from the previous slide, which is that the job losses were really concentrated amongst informal workers in the South African labor market. So I've tried to map out the changes in figure 3 here over a longer period of time. And I'm looking here at a gender breakdown and comparisons both between the overall category of informal employment and the subgroup within informal employment, which is the informal sector. And I've also mapped here sort of the 3 main events from the crisis in South Africa last year. I've marked where we had our initial strict lockdown, which is the red bar, wave 1 of the pandemic itself, and then the 4th quarter of 2020, where we had a second lockdown, not quite as severe, but then that coincided with the second wave of the pandemic. So really restricted the types of economic activities that we could have. So if you look at the gray line at the top, and then the blue line, then the yellow line. Sorry, let me try again. The gray line at the top, and then the yellow line below that. Those 2 lines denote, respectively, men's informal employment and men's informal sector employment. So what you can see there is the severe drop in the number of jobs by men in those 2 categories. And remember, the informal sector is a subgroup of the informal economy or informal employment. So it's included in that gray bar as well. We can see a slight recovery in the 3rd quarter of 2020, although very marginal compared to the number of jobs lost in the 2nd quarter of 2020, and then a flattening out of that line. So the last quarter of 2020 and even the 1st quarter of 2021, we can see very little recovery, and certainly nothing approaching the starting point if you move all the way to the left of those graphs. We certainly have not recovered anything close to the levels of employment, informal employment, that we had at the beginning of the crisis. If you then look at the blue line and the orange line, the 2 lower lines there, those denote the same 2 groups: women's informal employment, the broader category, and then women's informal sector employment, the subgroup within that. The only real difference, apart from the number of jobs there, would be a slightly more muted recovery after that quarter 2 initial loss of employment. So women didn't seem to rebound in the informal economy in that 3rd quarter. The line tends to be much flatter, and a very gradual and muted recovery post that severe shock to the labor market in the 2nd quarter of 2020. So certainly some gender differences in the loss of jobs and the recovery that's been noticed in a number of countries around the world in terms of comparisons between formal and informal employment. So if you take anything away from this graph, it's that the recovery from that initial shock has been very disappointing indeed, and we're certainly very much in the middle of the crisis. So another way to think about job losses in the informal economy is to focus in on subgroups. And a typical way, and then this is following the ILO framework, is to look at the different groups based on their employment, status in employment, as we typically call it. And we typically then look at own account workers, which I've described before, self-employed employers. So these are informal sector employers or informal sector entrepreneurs who hire other workers. So they may have small informal businesses with 2 or 3 employees. We have informal sector employees. Those are the groups that work inside those informal sector enterprises. We have formal sector employees. This would be the group that has no social protection, or perhaps not even, in this case, legal protection, a written contract, but works for a formal sector business. This would be the group that would be a strong parallel with precarious workers in the global north. So an Uber driver, for example, would probably be in a formal sector, an informal employee in the formal sector. And then we have a group that's quite large in South Africa, informal employment in private households. And these largely consist of women and domestic workers. So these are relative changes year on year, again, between 2019 and 2020, disaggregated by these 5 different groups of informal workers. So these are all different types of informal workers. Again, we can safely ignore Q1, where the changes are very small indeed. Just another way of saying that in 2020, in the first quarter, the world looked much as it did for informal workers, as it did the year prior to that in 2019. Of course, the job losses happened in quarters 2, 3, and 4. I could spend some time looking at the highly differentiated job losses and rates of job loss for all of these different groups, but I'll just draw your attention to the 2 groups that saw the largest and most sustained job losses in the informal economy. The gray bar that's circled there are informal sector employees, and then the black bar are those informal employees that work for formal businesses or formal enterprises. So again, those would be the precarious workers we've been talking about. So what you can see in quarters 2, 3, and 4 is that these 2 groups of employees, those that work inside informal sector businesses and those who are informal but work for formal businesses, they saw the single largest relative job losses in Q2 of 2020. So that was 35% of informal sector employees, and an astonishing near 50% loss of jobs amongst the most vulnerable workers in the formal sector. But what's also interesting about these groups, they don't tend to be the largest groups in the informal economy, but their job losses were certainly the largest. They've also made the slowest recovery. In particular, if you look at the precarious workers in our economy, there were something like 700,000, so 0.7 million sometime before the crisis. Their jobs have not returned. So companies have shed their most vulnerable workers. And even by the fourth quarter of 2020, still they were sort of 47% down on the same level of employment in the year before in the same quarter. So this really does show that the cost of the losses in the job losses in the South African labor market were borne very unequally, and typically by those who have the least agency. 2 groups of employees in the informal economy appear to have been the most expendable and have made the slowest recovery as the sort of pandemic has unfolded. I have glanced at the first 2 quarters of data from 2021. I haven't done it in great detail, but I can confirm that the picture doesn't become much more optimistic as time marches on. So there's not much cause for optimism, even though some of these, in this slide in particular, is slightly dated in terms of the fast-changing pandemic. A final slide on data before I sort of talk about how we approach this is to look at the industry sectors and how they've responded. So these tend to be the 6 sectors that employ the most informal workers in the South African labor market. But if we just look at the top 2, the gray line there is wholesale and retail trade. So that covers all sorts of informal trading activities. And then the green line denotes private households. And this is largely domestic workers, but also gardeners that don't have written contracts with the households in which they work and obviously have no social protection or UIF registration. So both of these sectors had very flat recoveries. In fact, if you look at all of the industry sectors denoted by the different colors there, we have that big dip in the second quarter of 2020. And one could argue that once those really strict regulations were relaxed, perhaps we would expect a flexible workforce like the informal economy to rebound. But what you can certainly see is that even though domestic workers in particular clawed their way back by the fourth quarter of 2020, still nowhere near the employment levels prior to the crisis, and then a dip in employment again in 2021. So certainly the domestic worker sector has not recovered in any meaningful way from the crisis. even though there are no regulations currently which would prevent them from working. So again, somewhat of a dismal picture. So this is my last slide, and I hope it's something that that spurs us in the discussion section, and I hope I haven't taken up too much time so far. The state response, and you'll see at the top there, I've put in parentheses relief or recovery, and I think it's important to keep in mind throughout this crisis and up to the moment, the current moment. It's not really clear if we're talking about relief or recovery. Is it safe to talk about relief in the midst of the ongoing job losses that we're currently experiencing? And of course, we have no idea what's coming. Will there be a fourth wave and another set of government restrictions and level 3 or 4? So it's very difficult to talk about recovery or relief, as these are certainly two different approaches to policy. I think the Institute for Economic Justice has made the case best by sort of having a point of departure that there can be no recovery unless there's first relief, particularly with the unsustainable levels of household and personal debt that have certainly been sort of taken on to deal with the crisis. But I suppose there must be something in our minds to keep us sort of clear about whether the policies we advocate for or we promote or we oppose are about immediate relief from the conditions which are currently here and which may return at any moment with another wave of the pandemic, or whether we're talking about longer term recovery. The edited volume that I've mentioned at the beginning is looking more forward, what lessons we can take from this particular crisis in terms of how we support labor markets and informal employment in particular going forward, how to avoid some of the inequalities that have been exposed by this particular crisis. But if I could summarize the South African state's response to the crisis as it applies or doesn't apply to the informal economy, I think we could sort of list 4 primary interventions. The first was the top-up of the child support grant, and that had a particular intention to reach those who aren't typically reached by South Africa's social grant system. As I mentioned at the beginning, the South African government was very concerned with the complete inability to target informal workers and the knowledge that informal workers and informal sector workers in particular would be left completely hanging by government restrictions and the impact of the pandemic. So adding the top-up amount to the child support grant after some careful modeling by researchers at the University of Cape Town's Soldier unit showed that topping up the child support grant would reach many households with informal workers in them. So that was an attempt to efficiently get cash into the pockets of informal workers and other groups who were missing, including the unemployed from the existing social security system. Then, of course, there was the 350 Rand a month social relief of distress grant, which has been on and off in various periods during the crisis. However, that amount was very low. If we think about the median income in the informal sector being somewhere around 2,000 Rand a month, and if we think about the minimum wage in South Africa being just over 3,500 Rand a month, certainly 350 Rand is not any meaningful substitute for that lost income. And of course, gets you not very far in general in South Africa. There were huge gender gaps, particularly for women informal workers. Those who received the child support grant were ineligible for this additional grant, even though by their very nature, those child support grants were meant to be spent on children. So a lot of informal workers and particularly women were excluded, and there was a very big gender gap in the rollout of that form of relief. The South African government has put a lot of emphasis into SMME support. There was a loan guarantee scheme. There were various types of tax deferments and a number of sector-specific support packages. But a lot of these missed the informal economy in general and the informal sector in particular. So these really didn't plug the gaps and were not really beneficial for the most vulnerable members of the labor force. So the gaps here are really what we've been talking about a lot, and South Africa is not alone in having these particular types of gaps. In particular, support for small, medium enterprises is a policy that's been promoted in a lot of countries, but specifically misses those who are unregistered on tax and VAT and other types of enterprise databases, which really leaves informal workers in South Africa and in many other countries really fending for themselves with the more or less devastation of their livelihoods. More broadly, the different approaches, the different frameworks that I'd mentioned earlier have promoted really a wide range of approaches. Incredibly, the World Bank in a fairly, I think, insensitive analysis of labor markets kind of doubled down on their sort of punitive approach to eliminating informality as a way of dealing with both inequality and the COVID crisis. It's a fairly frustrating read if anyone has the time. So in May of this year, their solution to dealing with the problem of informality was to streamline tax regulation to lower the cost of operating formally, so making formal employment more flexible and reducing the tax burden of formal firms, and increasing the cost of operating informally. So incredibly, the World Bank's approach to dealing with the devastation of the informal economy during the current crisis was to tax the informal sector workers more. So you can perhaps tell by the way I phrased that how I feel about that particular approach. But just to say that this is very closely tied with a very particular understanding of the nature of informality and seeing the informal sector as largely evading regulation and taxes. But I think there's some newer approaches that could perhaps get us away from just going back to the way things were, which was, as I mentioned at the beginning, not a very equitable sort of labor market to begin with. Some of these are quite specific, and to really have a nice overview of all the policy options we have in South Africa, both in the labor market and more broadly, you could do a lot worse than to go to the Institute for Economic Justice's website and to take a look at their very detailed and I think really helpful COVID-19 policy brief series. I find it a bit frustrating that every time the IEJ is mentioned in the media, it's prefaced with the left-leaning IEJ, but when journalists interview the Free Market Foundation, they don't seem to put any sort of ideological warning tag on that. But be that as it may, I think a lot of the policy prescriptions that come from the IEJ are extremely sensible in the current moment. Some, but not all of the ones that they've suggested. And again, some of these are more about relief, but some are longer term. There's a real need, I think, to rethink the expansion of the UIF to improve the reach for informal workers as well, and that would go for the temporary emergency relief scheme, the TERS as well. I don't think there's anything stopping us from expanding SMME support, and I think a number of people are certainly not opposed to the support that's being directed at small businesses. They are more vulnerable in this type of crisis, but why not expand that, particularly if we're often talking about the township economy in South Africa? Can't we expand some of that support to unregistered informal sector and own account activities? But the other complication, of course, is that a lot of policy which disadvantages the informal sector in particular is done at the local level. So there's a real opportunity to address the long-standing miscommunication and policy mismatch between local, provincial, and local government. And this could perhaps be pushed through an organization such as the South African Local Government Association. Some work had started on this before the crisis, but I would suggest there's some urgency for SOLGA to bring those different spheres of government together to align policy to be supportive of the informal sector. And then, of course, I think there are a whole range of highly sensible policies about comprehensive social protection, both in terms of immediate relief to address, which is nothing short of an ongoing humanitarian disaster in South Africa, but also thinking long-term about how we link, we support the labor market with comprehensive social protection. You'll all be aware, no doubt, of debates about universal basic income, and there are lots of different types of support that can be extended to the South African informal economy, particularly now that it should be clear to policymakers that the informal sector is not a safety net or a sort of a release valve for the formal sector. It requires support in its own right. And if I hadn't mentioned at the beginning, it is about a third of our labor market, our workforce, that's taken this incredible hit and is bearing the brunt. I've said nothing about earnings losses in this presentation, just job losses. That earnings data isn't yet available from Statistics South Africa, but I think when we unpeel the different layers of the impact of this crisis, we'll see beyond these job losses that I've described in the informal economy, we're also going to see massive losses in earnings, which is really going to fuel the ongoing inequality we've experienced in the labor market and in the economy more broadly. So let me stop there. I'd love to hear any comments or thoughts you have about, or questions you might have about how I've done the analysis, or certainly I'd be interested in hearing sort of responses and reflections on this last slide about how we think about this and how we take it forward. So thanks for your time, and over to you, Prof. van der Walt. You're going to chair the discussion.
Yeah, I'll do that. I think let's take the slide down so that when people speak, we can see them. All right, everybody, thanks very much for attending this. I see some people have joined us in the way during the course of things. So what we'll do is we'll take a number of questions, and we're going to let Mike respond to a few of those. So pop something in the chat box or stick up your hand, and I'll also ask Valens to also just keep a bit of an eye out because we're spreading over several screens. Before I forget, I just want to mention our next seminar will be on the 20th of October. It'll be Conisa and Tekinka, who'll be looking at labor in global value chains, the case of South African agriculture. That'll be on the 20th. And I'm going to pop it in the chat box. Just to emphasize, we do a very wide range of things, and we love debate, we're open to debate, and we don't have like a party line. So we're very heterodox among ourselves. And I really want to thank Mike for also bringing things into a bit of a dialogue between the more economics kind of field and the more social science, so-called social science. I think you guys are kind of social science, some of you. I know we had a nasty divorce in the 1880s. So thanks very much for bringing that in. Let's take some hands and some comments. Again, feel free. You can raise a range of issues. People can also engage with other people's comments. I've noted Luca. Is there anybody else? Nope. All right. Luca, let's start with you, and hopefully we'll drag some other comments out. Fire away, man. Unmute, eh?
Oh, okay. I can't see myself in the camera there. I have first of all, let me say to Rogan that I've always had this perception that the economics department doesn't care about social science issues. But then I'm glad that because the person that I always see here is David Fryer. So I thought he's the only one who cares from the department thereof. But I have two questions, and I suppose comments in the middle of that. When you were describing certain what you call concepts there, there's is it a choice, or rather a result of the structural duality of the economy in which it is the nature of the formalized economy that you found these people rather than it being a choice? Or should I rephrase that question again? Like you say, it's a choice that they run away from cumbersome restrictions, but rather it seems to me that it's just the result of the structure of that economy itself, that there are no restrictions in that sector of the economy. The second question is that you said that there's an intrinsic link between the formal economy and the informal economy, and you mentioned that there's a supply of cheap goods and services, but if you can think about it, it's also a supply of certain goods and services that it's sort of like difficult to formalize. For example, most of the people who sell at the rank, they sell foods that are traditional, or other ones would be illegal, like traditional foods like kota, or they will sell amanglina, chicken feet and stuff like that. So this is the type of food that you can't find in a restaurant, you see. So it's cheap, but at the same time, it's the kind of food that it's hard to formalize and create a business that people can put investments into. So it's like a loophole that somebody can find and live on, even though it's not even though it's cheap, it's not a product that you can formalize, you see, and sell in a proper, in inverted commas, in a proper like restaurant. The second part about the relationship that I think is that the formal economy seems to be characterized, insofar as consumer goods and services are concerned, by the view that the buyer has formal employment, and income, and the benefits that come with that income. You see, because the other day I was at I was at the Capitec there, and I'm looking across house. Is it electric? House and electric. I can't get the house and electric. So when I look there, I see like an advert, and the advert it shows like a TV sale with a microwave, I think. Yeah. So it's like it's like 18,000. And then when you check into how you can buy this on an installment, the amount that the total amount that you're gonna be paying after like 36 months or so, I think it's like double, probably like 24,000, like double the price if you were to buy it cash. So if you were to buy something like that, the assumption is that you are a formal employee, and so we can tax you on a go, and to a point where you even pay double the amount of the actual price that you will buy if you were taking it for if you were taking it for cash. So it seems like that's the assumption in the formal economy. And then, but then on the informal sector or the informal economy, you find that there is a kind of a hustler entrepreneurial mentality, if you think about it. You see, so you just find something that you can sell and make money as quick as possible if it can be sold at that time. Well, so, and then there's the kind of a hand to mouth kind of income. So you sell something and then you're going to consume and use it, and probably some small kind of savings to pay rent if you are renting, and probably you live in the location, you see. So those are the things that I was thinking about as you were presenting this part about the relationship between the formal economy and informal economy. And then there's I didn't quite know how to place this, because in South Africa, right, you will find the formal enterprises, right, like Shoprite and this stuff. And then down the line, before you get to the informal sector, you have like the Pakistani shops, you know what I'm saying? So the Pakistani shops, they sell goods that are of the same price as what you'll find in ShopRite, but they're exactly next door in the location, you see, where it is now, if you can't go to town, you can buy here. So how do you characterize them? Are they in an informal economy or formal economy? Because they sell consumer goods that are of the price and of the same kind of quality that you will find at ShopRite, but it's just the difference of the location, you see. And then also there's the issue of, I was thinking about the issue of the looting. How did looting affect the informal sector in the period that it occurred? And the last issue that I want to raise is the issue of the national debt, insofar as the government is is helping or relieving this situation, who actually is going to pay the debt that the government has accumulated over this period? You see, thank you.
Thanks, Luca. I've noted Precious. Would you like to take the floor? And Wisdom. Precious, then Wisdom.
So I don't know, can you see me?
Yeah, you
Can you see me too? Okay, I was looking at the question you asked on do informal economies act as safety net for formal sector workers who lose their jobs during a crisis? I would say not to a large margin, because workers in the formal sector are more or less in a secured kind of job. And during the COVID-19, quite a number of them didn't lose their jobs. Even when they had to stay at home because of the restriction, they still received their salaries, especially when you look at especially workers in the public sector, workers working with the government. They stayed at home, they observed all the protocols of COVID-19, but they were still receiving their salary. So the people that were actually
you broke up a little bit there, Precious. I think we've lost Precious. I think when I'm sure she'll come back on, and then we can resume that. Wisdom. Unmute yourself, Wisdom. Thanks.
Okay, there you go. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, Mr. Rogan. Funny enough, just last Friday, I attended a talk by I think the DBSA chief economist, Zef Mshego, and he was pretty much addressing round about the same issues, particularly surrounding social. But then I suppose beyond that, I suppose I would like to hear what your comment is, because what he particularly cited was the fact that underlying that and underlying where the economy is right now is the fact that the government has not been able to grow the economy. And that being so, the second comment that I would like to hear from me is how much, I suppose, going into the future would this take to get, I suppose, the economy back on track as from a growth standpoint of view, because in his appreciation of that, he mentioned that unless the economy starts, getting on the positive side, the labor issues and the social rights issues are just going to be a bleeding wound that will lead our economy to be run our economy. So I suppose I just want to hear what your comments are on those two. Thank you.
Thanks, Wisdom. Precious, would you like to pick up again?
Yes, please, if I'm allowed to.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it. I think keep the video off, and we can.
Okay, yeah, yes, that's what I'm doing now. So I think that workers in the informal sector on the whole, they received much of the shock more than the ones in the formal sector. Because for me, for example, if I want to use Nigeria as a case study, most of the workers in the formal sector have retained their jobs. some of them have returned to their jobs, but the ones in the informal sector are still suffering the shocks and the repercussions of the lockdown. They are yet to recover from their losses. And for the formal sector workers, they could even work remotely, but that wasn't happening for the informal sector. And for the ones that had to force themselves out to go and work, they also stood at a disadvantage in terms of being exposed. They were not properly protected, and so they were exposed to all manner of probabilities of contacting the disease. So for me, where I would actually want to probably drop my point is that the recovery process for the informal sector worker is still very slow and tedious, because I think that policies are not strong enough to be able to enable them to come back to business and be able to get back from the losses that they have suffered. So we really have to probably still engage the government more in terms of policies that can help to reboost the economy so that the informal sector workers can find back their feet. That's the bit I would like to say.
Thank you, Precious. Well, Mike, there's quite a bit there. I think I'm just mindful of the time. Let me just throw in a quick one, which is linked to one of the points Luca made. Obviously, the IEJ, well, left-leaning or whatever, is a very important think tank, and it's one which has got historic links to labor movements and so on. And it comes as a result from a very particular economic framework, which it's largely Keynesian in orientation. I was just wondering, to pick up the point that had been made by Luca, how will all of this be funded? I mean, I think there's a clear social justice reason why one would want to continue to fund UIF tours and extend the social grants and that. But there's a sustainability issue in that, for example, a lot of the UIF tourist funding has been done through raiding reserves. And whether this can continue is a good question. And the related thing is whether this will itself lead to a stimulus in the economy or will simply lead to people essentially buying cheap imported goods. So that's the one question. The other one, I was just wondering, if we're talking about the problem of dualism, whether informal sector is really the term to use. I mean, we're aggregating quite a lot of people on the basis of the degree to which they're regulated and obviating quite significant structural differences. And it can, I know that's not your intention, lead to a sort of reproduction of the dualist model, whether the two economies or the township economy or whichever variation. So let me leave it there. I think let's, you respond, and then we'll see how we're doing for time. Thanks.
Yeah, well, thanks for the questions and comments. I guess the first thing I would say to all four of you, Luca, Precious, Wisdom, and Lucian, is that it sounds like I would probably agree with you guys on the way you've sort of framed your questions. But let me sort of pick up a few of those. I obviously won't be able to get to all of them. So Luca, if I could pick up on your point around the idea if the informal economy is a choice, and then I think the example you gave of the production of unique foods that you can't buy anywhere else is a useful example to sort of unpick that. So I mean, the four frameworks that I sort of presented at the beginning, were necessarily broad to try and make some sense and group the different sort of ideological and sort of economic ways of thinking about the choice to become informal or the reason for being informal. So there's a lot to say about that, and we could get quite detailed. But I think the point is that the group that particularly sees informal employment as a choice assumes that there's a possibility to be formal. So there's a layer of formal self-employed people or enterprises that look exactly like the informal self-employed, the sort of top layer of the informal economy, and that there's quite a bit of overlap between them. So these studies are based in places like Brazil, Mexico, Peru, where they identify a group of entrepreneurs that they can't separate on any meaningful metric in terms of sector, earnings, turnover, except for their status as formal or informal, and largely to do with some type of registration, perhaps for value-added tax or income tax, or registration with the relevant authorities. So the argument there is that we should best think of the informal economy as being a desirable option chosen by a large segment of the people who make up those 2.2 billion workers, or 60% of the global workforce. So the point, I think, is that I think, in my reading of the data, is that the vast majority of the informal economy doesn't fit that depiction at all. In fact, if you choose a few things to describe the characteristics of informal firms, if we want to use the language firms or enterprise, something like 3% or less of those 2.2 billion, probably much less, seem to fit into that sort of model where they could be operating formally, but they find an advantage to operating informally. I just don't think it's a true representation of the global informal workforce, and it certainly doesn't seem to fit in South Africa, where a very small percent of the self-employed could be considered some type of entrepreneur that would be able to expand if we could take away the red tape or the punitive side of taxation. So think about your example of someone who sells cooked goods that are traditional, chicken feet and things like that. So, the question there, and, we don't need to get too detailed because we're trying to deal in aggregate labor market statistics here. Would those people, and if you picture them working at a taxi rank, are the reason they are doing that particular job, is it because they're avoiding taxes or regulations? Is it to some economic advantage? So my suspicion, and what the data would largely suggest, is that those people earn so far below any type of tax threshold that it doesn't seem to make sense. And remember, the tax threshold in South Africa is quite a bit higher than the minimum wage in the formal sector. And if you think about the median level of earnings being something around 2,000 Rand a month for the informal sector, it doesn't strike me that we would be in a good position to argue that people that sell those types of goods and services, while not necessarily available in the formal sector, are doing so voluntarily per se. And I don't mean making those providing those goods and services in the informal sector as opposed to the formal sector, but working in the formal sector as opposed to selling something that gets them a meager sort of income in the informal economy. The other point, though, is it turns out, and there have been some interesting qualitative and to some extent quantitative studies, sorry, it's a dog, showing that the vast majority of the ingredients and things that are sold in the informal sector, including for people who make traditional foods. Sorry, I'm going to have to deal with this 2 seconds. Are largely selling goods that originated in the formal sector. There's an interesting book called Kazinomics, which sort of, I don't agree with a lot of it, but documents the way that people sort of repackage goods, in particular food products from the formal sector, often sort of originating in the highly concentrated goods market in South Africa, Tiger brands, Unilever, things like that. And using those ingredients to sell cooked and prepared and even traditional types of food in the informal sector. And that appears to be a unique South African characteristic as well, largely given the highly concentrated formal sector that we have here. So yeah, I mean, I guess I would just ask you to step back a little bit and sort of think which of those models, you'll always find exceptions as well, but which of those models describes the informal sector in South Africa? So we have what we can see with our eyes, the way people sort of eke out to living in the informal sector. We have the labor market surveys, which I've just shown, which suggest that people really are working at the margins, and there's very little room for them to move up the supply chains and sort of expand into successful registered sort of enterprises. And Kate Phillip has written fairly convincingly on this in her book called Markets at the Margins. So I'm not promoting books, but if I could, I would suggest taking a look at that. I think she gives the most realistic account of what it's like to earn a living in the South African informal sector. I'll come back to your question about debt in a moment. I'll link that with Prof. Lucian's comment. So Precious, yeah, you know the reasons that you outlined your hypothesis on why informal sector workers in particular would be more likely to lose their jobs than formal workers, I think is spot on, and I think that's largely the reason that the ILO gave those early warnings that something like 1.6 to 1.9 billion workers were likely to lose their livelihoods and not be able to afford food in the first couple of months of the crisis. But there is a counter argument to that, and it's emerging in the literature as the pandemic unfolds and data come out from various household surveys and labor force surveys around the world. And there's an argument that, well, initially, yes, there was a sharp shock due to the pandemic and the sort of extreme government responses around the world. But ultimately, some of those small to medium enterprises in the formal sector have disappeared. We've lost restaurants, we've lost small businesses across the various services sectors, and those jobs have been lost from the formal sector and they're gone. Whereas on the other hand, now that the restrictions are sort of slightly lifted, the flexibility that informal workers have allows them to be more resilient. In other words, they have more options at their disposal. And this isn't about the workers that were furloughed. These are about the workers whose companies and employers have sort of folded up. And there has admittedly been a lot of that around the world in the formal sector as well. But what I think is coming out of the data, and certainly the South African data and some of the data from Peru that I've seen come out, is that while there are possible explanations for both occurrences, the data still seem to suggest that the informal economy has not been as resilient as the formal economy. So I guess my response to you, Precious, would be that I agree with you, and I think the data suggests what you are saying is certainly what's happening, but that there is an alternative sort of hypothesis out there, and some data in some context does show the opposite. So, I think the thing to do is to, it's still early days, studies are still being published. National statistical agencies and labor force surveys were put on hold for the pandemic. So a lot of the data that we have to sort of investigate this further is still coming out. But what I've shown from the South African data is that it certainly does not seem plausible to claim that the informal economy has somehow been more resilient as the crisis unfolds. We've now got 6 quarters of post-crisis data, and the story seems fairly consistent that the informal sector has really taken the larger knock here, and that's without even considering the earnings data, which we don't yet have. Wisdom. Lots of concern about the size of the economy, when it's going to grow again, and how we can afford things that we're doing if we don't grow the economy first. Well, there is at least one post-Keynesian on the call here. Perhaps he would jump up at some stage, but I guess I think we all agree that we want the economy to grow, and unless the pie expands, there's less to distribute around. I don't think that's necessarily contested, but I would worry a little bit about putting the cart before the horse if we would sort of say, well, before we provide support or relief or spending and invest in people, that we first have to grow the economy. The economy is people, and this isn't a debate we're going to resolve now. This has been going on for centuries. But just something to note about the South African economy: 55% of South Africans live in households below what is essentially a very crude poverty line, which was calculated in the early 2000s, which is the amount of money a person would need to barely have enough calories to survive. And 55% of South Africans before the crisis lived in a household where they didn't have spending power to replace the calories they burned from getting out of bed in the morning. So, you know, we can talk about aggregate demand and there'll be Keynesian and classical sort of disagreements about that. But if we think about the South African economy and spending power, there's a lot of consumption that doesn't occur in South Africa, and a lot of purchasing that doesn't occur simply because of the lack of income in households. So, you know, if we didn't just look at the debt to GDP ratio and we looked at which households are able to spend what, you know, I think there's a pretty strong case for stimulus spending in a you know, at the best of times, but at the moment we're at the worst of times. And, you know, also our, you know, just keeping it specifically related to COVID, we had one of the most severe lockdowns in the world. But if you look at other countries that had the same level of restrictions, they had much more generous support packages, whereas we tended to ask people not to earn a living, but then didn't provide much in return. So it's difficult to separate the humanitarian crisis side from the economy side because they're inevitably linked. And I do fear that we're keeping our eyes on the wrong metrics here, particularly at a point where we're nowhere near out of the woods. And there's a consequence to this that we can only kick down the road for so long, I think. But to your other question, when will the economy grow again? I'm constantly bemused by the confidence of the projections that come out quarterly, both globally from the IMF, both nationally for the IMF and by the Treasury for South Africa, 1.6%, 3 quarters from now. All of this is bewildering, given that we have no idea what's coming our way. Obviously, it's okay to have a baseline projection, assuming we're over the worst of this and we don't have to shut the economy down in the 4th quarter of 2021 again, which is coming up pretty soon. But yeah, I'm not super convinced about the crystal ball gazing about when the economy's going to recover again. And it also seems that people have doubled down on the positions before. You know, if you read some of the local sort of news articles, I saw an interview this morning with one of the sort of well-known contributors to the sort of public discourse about GDP and the economy, really just double or tripling down on labor market flexibility is the only way to grow the economy and get us back up again. So many of the old debates that we had before seem to be sort of resurfacing about when the economy is going to grow and how we get it up and running again. But I'd show my hand and sort of suggest that I think without some sort of stimulus and getting households back up and running again, I think that's always going to be an impediment to economic growth. And I think we're underestimating the impact of the crisis on the bottom half of the income distribution. That's my sense. Yeah. So Lucian, how will this be funded? I don't know. That would be my answer. It's not a particularly something I've looked at in particular. I do know that our debt to GDP ratio is higher than many other countries, and this has caused much wailing and gnashing of teeth. But there are those who suggest that it's a false metric, and particularly in a time like this, we should take a more nuanced view and look at where household consumption is and where that contributes to in the economy. So I think it would be about taking a more detailed look about which sectors are supported. And I think the real concern is how nuanced our government can be in terms of guiding the recovery and the investment in which sectors of the economy, both in terms of a demand for labor and a contribution to GDP. I think the detail is really important there, and I think you could have some long and probably fairly ferocious debates about where the money would come from. But I think without really understanding where the impact has been, and what we can realistically do would really be the more interesting way to approach your question. And then finally, thanks, Sundin, for coming. Finally, your point about the informal sector is one that we've really debated a long time, because it tends to sort of reinforce the first and second economy debates we had in the early 2000s, when Thabo Mbeki famously described the first economy as consisting of good jobs, good incomes, nice houses, nice cars, and the second economy consisting of poverty, poor housing, poor health, informal jobs, and that these two were unlinked with each other. And we've sort of been pushing back against that quite a bit, particularly around the concept of the first economy and the second economy. There's only one economy. There's just some people are sort of subordinated within that economy. And obviously concepts like labor market segmentation, I think, help us get towards understanding the relationship between the different components of the economy and how they tend to enforce the structure that we inherited from the recent past. But the term informal sector comes from a compromise with at the International Conference for Labor Statisticians, where some of these frameworks for measurement were developed. And the reason for using the term informal economy, which also has the tendency to sort of disguise different types of informal employment, and also imply that there's a separate economy from the formal economy.
Hello.
Okay, thanks, Valence. Well, I can see people are sort of dropping off anyway, and we've gone well over our sort of time. I see there's a question about the recording. Valence, can you just explain how people could access the recording for this webinar and the other ones?
Sure. So I see some people have sent the emails in the chat.
Yes,
and we'll make it available on our YouTube channel as well. It will also be recorded as a podcast, so we will make that available.
Thanks, Valence. All right, so I've missed a bit. My internet's going down. Can people hear me?